All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all. Brian, let's get started.
Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Met Technical Airlift and a session entitled End User Security and Exchange Server, or an alternate title, Hybrid Modern Authentication in Exchange Server, HMA. Let me try my presenting Teams again. There we go. And there we go. There we go. There's my presentation. Okay, so welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Reid. I work for NB Consult, a gold partner based out of the United Kingdom, Hong Kong, and South Africa. I'm based in England, and although England's a country with lots and lots of broadband and good internet capacity, my internet is rubbish at the moment, and I'm having a problem with my router, and every so often it reboots. So I have a problem whereby I might get disconnected from the call in the middle of the call. I'm going to pick up my phone and I'm going to carry on talking to you, and we're going to attempt to do that. And 3 minutes later, when my router reboots, I will come back. So my apologies in advance if I am disconnected from you. Sorry for that. Engineer was out this morning and we haven't fixed the problem. But we'll go through the presentation, and hopefully I don't have any problems in this next hour. So we're going to, as I say, look at hybrid modern authentication. And what we're going to cover today is what hybrid modern authentication is and why we'd want to implement it. And as well as wanting to consider the implementation of it, we're going to see what the potential issues are. Right? Now, that's the slide with the most detail, or slides, multiple slides on that. That said, it's actually not a very difficult thing to implement. Right? But these are the things I've come across when implementing this for clients. We'll have a look at the end user experience, which is next to nothing. The user really doesn't notice anything, which is great. Okay. We'll have a demo of the implementation, and then we'll have some final steps, things to consider, and hopefully we've got time and we'll have some Q&A at the end. If you've got any questions as we go through the slides, please add them to the chat. Especially while if I happen to lose my internet connection and you're there waiting for me to come back, if you can think of some questions, pop them into the chat at that time, and we'll go back into the chat at the Q&A time, and we'll answer those questions then. Okay. So what is hybrid modern authentication? Well, it's an improvement over the built-in authentication within Exchange Server. So within Exchange Server, you connect to Exchange Server, and it connects to Active Directory to authenticate. The responsibility of checking who you are and doing the endpoint for authentication and so on is Exchange backed by Active Directory. The idea of hybrid modern authentication is that we can move the authentication out to a different identity provider, to Azure AD. It's only Azure AD. Hybrid modern authentication is based on Azure AD, Azure Identity Provider, and not Active Directory Exchange Server on premises. So Exchange Server becomes responsible solely for your mail. Azure Active Directory becomes responsible for your authentication. And because Azure Active Directory is the system logging your users in effect, first of all, it's token-based and not password-based. So it's not basic authentication, for example. You probably know lots about basic authentication being turned off in the cloud. Well, basic authentication is still available in Exchange Server, but it'll get turned off. This allows us to turn it off in Exchange Server, for example. But it also allows us to change authentication methods. For example, and here's the big one, it allows us to add options such as MFA, but also passwordless, terms of access, so messages that appear on the screen before we log in, and stuff like that. There's lots of options that are available to us in Azure AD that are not available to us in plain vanilla Exchange Server backed by Active Directory. So an alternative authentication method, and reasons for enabling it. Well, obviously, if MFA becomes an option, then that's a big reason for enabling it. But it also allows us to turn basic authentication off on premises in Exchange Server. And specifically, that's Exchange Server 2019 and not the earlier versions. But if you're running Exchange Server 2019, you can turn basic authentication off after you've enabled hybrid modern auth. Okay. You gain the improvements of Azure Active Directory as your IDP without moving mailboxes to Exchange Online. Now, obviously, moving Exchange mailbox to Exchange Online gives me a whole bunch of other benefits and potential disadvantages to the cloud, and that depends on your organization and your network and your ability to do cloud, for example. But if I can keep my mailbox on premises, because that's what I need to do, then I can gain IDP benefits such as better sign-in logs and stuff like that. So I can log into Azure AD portal and I can look at the sign-in logs and I can see potentially reasons why the user failed to sign in and so on. So there's benefits there from an administrative perspective. Okay. We've said MFA becomes an option, but conditional access is really what becomes an option. Anything that I can do with Azure Active Directory conditional access, I can do with Exchange Server now. So it's not just Exchange Online and all the other apps that go with it, it's Exchange Server as well. So if I want to do Exchange Server only on company device, for example, I've got company devices compliant and Intune, I can now do that for Exchange Server. I want to do passwordless. For example, I've got a YubiKey fob here. I can plug that in and do passwordless. Well, that's authenticating to Azure AD, and so I can do that. And with the passwordless token, I can sign in to Exchange Server. Okay. The mobile client, Outlook Mobile, can be managed by Endpoint Manager, and we can enforce app protection policies for our on-premises mailboxes, so limiting copy and paste and a number of other things that app protection policies allow. We can do that for our on-premises mailboxes when we implement hybrid modern auth. Okay, and we've turned on, actually there's a repeat notice in the Exchange 2019 for basic authentication. So how do I implement it? Okay, well, I implement it by running 2 PowerShell commandlets. Okay, that sounds like a very small amount of work, and to some extent it is a very small amount of work. There's a little bit of prerequisite. Some of that prerequisite you might find you've already got implemented within your Exchange Server environments. Some of the prerequisites you might need to do. So for some companies it's going to be a lot of work. For some companies it's going to be a small amount of work, and then 2 PowerShell commandlets. So I sell it as a very easy thing to turn on. It is a very easy thing to turn on with a little bit of prerequisites, and we'll look at what they are, and we'll run a demo of it as well. Okay. So what do I really need as well as those 2 PowerShell commandlets? I need to get all my Exchange URLs, so things like my ActiveSync URL, my MAPI URL, my auto-discover URL. Okay. I need all my URLs added to Azure Active Directory. I need to tell Azure Active Directory that if I come to it saying mail.contoso.com as my application service principal name, then it knows what my application is. It knows my application is a valid application and that it can log me on to that. And so in an Exchange Server environment, I might have a set of URLs. So for example, I might have mailus.contoso.com, mailindia.contoso.com, mailuk.contoso.com, or I may have a global namespace like mail.contoso.com. And so whichever combination of URLs I have, different URLs for different sites, or one URL for all my sites, I need to collect all my Exchange URLs, autodiscover.contoso.com in that example as well, and upload them to Azure Active Directory. I also need to implement Azure Active Directory Connect. Okay. I've got to have all of my users synced to Azure Active Directory. When I turn this feature on, when I turn on hybrid modern auth, all of my users authenticate via Azure AD. I don't have some users in Azure AD and some users doing the old system. Okay. Now, I might do, depends on the client, but it's for a given client. So let's say for Outlook Desktop, it doesn't matter who the user is. Outlook Desktop goes to authenticate and it gets redirected to the cloud to authenticate. And then the username is given. So I can't say for Bob, let's authenticate in the cloud, and for Mary, let's authenticate on premises. So I need to make sure that Azure Active Directory has the full list of all my users. So if you're only, let's say, doing Azure AD Connect at the moment and a subset of your users, you would need to make sure all your users are replicated to the cloud. Right. You don't need to do groups and stuff like that. It's just for user authentication. But of course, if you've got your groups replicated as well, that's fine. Specifically, though, it's all your users need to be in Azure Active Directory. Okay. It won't work if I do SSL offloading. Okay. I can do SSL bridging. So I can do client to load balancer over SSL. I can have the load balancer present the certificate and terminate the SSL session. And then the load balancer make a new SSL session to the Exchange server. So it's SSL to load balancer, SSL again to the Exchange server. I can do that. SSL ends at the Exchange server. But what I can't do is a client to load balancer over SSL, and then the load balancer does HTTP, so non-SSL, to Exchange server. That would be SSL offloading. So it doesn't work with SSL offloading. It's got to be HTTPS all the way through, terminated and rebuilt on the load balancer if you have one. And the clients need to support modern authentication. Now, at this point, most of my clients are going to support modern authentication. You know, the versions of Outlook that are in support do, Outlook Mobile does, the native iOS Mail app does, and the native Gmail app on Android phones does, as well as some of the other phone apps, so some of the phone email apps on both Android and iOS, like 9work, for example, but there are others. There are a lot more email apps, certainly on mobile phones, that only do basic authentication. Those wouldn't work if you were still using those. Okay, so there's my requirements. So you might find, for example, you've got users with an out-of-date version of Outlook 2010, for example. That does not do modern auth, but the in-support versions of Outlook do. Okay, so there's a couple of bits of information to gather, and then you're ready to look at the steps for implementing it. Okay, and we'll come and do that in the demo. What issues might I see? Well, this is a collection of things that I've seen when I've been implementing this for some of my customers. Okay, this first one was the best one. I got it up top because it took the longest to resolve. It was a load balancer example issue, and in the particular customer where I saw this, the load balancer, so it was client, in this case mobile device to load balancer SSL. The load balancer terminated the SSL session and had the certificate on the load balancer, and then the load balancer would make a new SSL session into the Exchange server. But the certificate on the load balancer was just the certificate for mail.contoso.com. It wasn't the intermediate and the root certificates. They hadn't been loaded onto a load balancer, and a process called auto detect, not to be confused with auto discover, a process called auto detect had problems with that, and we had to make sure that the load balancers had the intermediate and root certificates, and it all worked. Okay, we'll come back to a bit more about auto detect later on because it's a useful thing to be aware of. Okay, another issue is if you've got Outlook Mobile configured already, okay, before you implement hybrid modern auth, then Outlook Mobile will have configured a basic authentication profile, and that won't change. Okay, so if you're on Exchange Server 2016, for example, you've configured Outlook Mobile basic auth profile, that will keep working because you can't turn basic auth off in Exchange 2016. But if you have Exchange Server 2019 and you turn on hybrid modern auth and then turn off basic auth, that would cause these Outlook Mobile users to break because they can't do basic authentication anymore. Okay, so if you've got Outlook Mobile, if you've got Outlook Mobile and you've already created a profile, you delete the profile, recreate the profile after hybrid modern auth has been turned on, and it will make a modern authentication profile. So there's no data loss or anything like that. You'll just delete the profile, recreate the profile. But you can go into active sync settings and you can get a report and see which users are running Outlook Mobile in basic profile mode, and therefore which users will need to have their profile removed and added back again. Okay. Your clients need to be able to reach Azure Active Directory because that's where your IDP is. Okay. So if you've got some of your users with no internet connectivity, or you've got firewalls with limited internet connectivity on them, you'll need to make sure that every client everywhere, both inside the office and outside the office, is able to reach Azure Active Directory. If you can't reach Azure Active Directory, you can't log in. If you can't log in, you get no email. There's no, if I fail to reach the IDP, I fail back to basic. There's no concept of that. Once I turn on hybrid modern auth, if my client supports modern authentication, it has to do modern authentication or it will fail to authenticate. To do modern authentication in Outlook 2016 and later does it by default. Outlook 2013 needs a registry key and it should be patched. up to the latest version. Frankly, if you're running Outlook 2013 and it's not patched to the latest version, which is a number of years old already, that will be a problem anyway for lots of reasons. But Outlook 2013 needs the enable ADAL registry key turned on. There's also a version registry key that goes with that. Outlook 2016 requires that enable ADAL registry key is not turned off. Okay, for example, there is a couple of articles out on the internet that says, if you've got this problem, here's the way I fixed it. I turned off Modern Auth in Outlook 2016. And so, of course, potentially there's a scenario out there where you've turned off Modern Authentication, or you've set that registry key in Outlook 2016. If you turn on Hybrid Modern Auth, your Outlook clients won't connect because they're unable to do the connection from the client end. So you need to make sure enable ADAL key is rolled out to all your 2013 clients, but not turned off in your 2016 and later clients. What else might you see as a potential issue? It works with MAPI over HTTP. It does not work with Outlook Anywhere. So it does not work with MAPI, RPC over HTTP. Okay? You need to move the users to MAPI over HTTP. So the MAPI HTTP setting needs to be enabled for the user. There's some benefits with it if it's not, though. We'll come back to that. Okay? But it won't work with Outlook Anywhere. Okay? It's turned on at an organizational level. You can't turn it on per mailbox. So when I come and turn on Hybrid Modern Auth, it's on for everybody. Okay? There's a potential risk in a project. You might go, well, what happens if I turn it on and it doesn't work and nobody can log in? So obviously, turning it on will be a weekend type job. We turn it on, but we can turn it on, turn it off again fairly quickly. We can turn it on, test it, turn it off again if we have problems. It is just 2 PowerShell commands. So it is very easy to turn on and then turn off again. Okay? I say you can't enable it per mailbox. If your users are using Outlook Anywhere and not MAPI over HTTP, then if you turned on Hybrid Modern Auth, they would keep using Basic Auth because Outlook Anywhere uses basic authentication. But what that means is you've now got everybody on Outlook Anywhere. We've never moved them to MAPI over HTTP, for example. You've got everybody on Outlook Anywhere on Basic Auth. You've turned on Hybrid Modern Auth, but nobody's using it. You can now go to individual mailboxes and change them to MAPI over HTTP. When they change to MAPI over HTTP, they will start doing Modern Authentication because Modern Authentication only works with MAPI over HTTP. And so that's a way to do this feature per mailbox. Okay, so it's a bit of a roundabout backwards sort of process. I wouldn't recommend it if you're already moved all your users to MAPI over HTTP. There, it's going to be an organization level setting, turn it on, and it's going to affect everybody. But as we'll see from a slide shortly, there is next to no user impact, as long as you've done everything right, of course. Okay. But if you are still Outlook Anywhere, one of my clients was, for example, we can use that as a way of piloting it. So you can turn on MAPI over Hybrid Hybrid Modern Auth, and then for a few mailboxes, turn on MAPI over HTTP, make sure your Hybrid Modern Auth works, and then turn on MAPI on HTTP for everybody. Right. Other issues you may see. Okay. In Exchange Online, you can have, or rather in Azure Active Directory, you can have conditional access policies that apply to Exchange Online. Exchange Server, for the purposes of Azure Active Directory, is treated just like Exchange Online. So the application in Azure Active Directory is Exchange Online. It's not that there's 2 applications, one's Exchange Online and one's Exchange Server, and you can have different policies for both. In Azure Active Directory, it's one application, Exchange Online. So if, for example, you have a hybrid environment and you've already turned on, let's say, MFA required everywhere for Exchange Online, and then you turn on Hybrid Modern Auth, you now need MFA required everywhere for your on-premises mailboxes as well. Okay. Obviously, of course, you could have policies that apply to groups. So you could have a group of cloud mailboxes and a different group of on-prem mailboxes and have the MFA rule only applying to the cloud mailboxes. But on a more simple level, if you had a very simple conditional access rule, all apps MFA everywhere, a really simple rule, or you had security defaults in Azure Active Directory turned on, which would do that for you, it's going to implement that for Exchange Server as well. Okay. For Exchange Server, you need the OAuth configuration properly set up. Now, that's done by the hybrid wizard that comes with Exchange Server when you're setting up Exchange Server to move mailboxes to Exchange Online. The OAuth configuration is done as part of that, unless you ran the hybrid wizard like years ago, in which case it won't be done, and you would just run the hybrid wizard again to configure OAuth configuration. So that needs to be set up and working, and it may well be done again. As I said earlier, some of these settings you've got may well be done in advance of you even thinking about turning on hybrid modern auth. Okay. And as we said earlier, actually I said earlier, internal and external authentication requires a trip to the cloud. If I'm in the office or out of the office, authentication is done by Azure Active Directory, and therefore I need to be able to reach Microsoft's cloud. And if I can't reach it, I can't authenticate. So last slide, I think it's my last slide. Last slide I've got on potential issues. Okay, modern authentication is turned on in Office 365. Okay, if your tenant precedes 2017, that may not be the case. Okay? Although the team that are turning off basic authentication in Exchange Online are proactively turning this setting on for older tenants anyway. So come October, that setting is going to be turned on for you, even if it's not already turned on. But it needs to be turned on if you were going to do this before October, for example. A service called Auto-Discover v2 is used by the Auto-Detect service. That service is not site aware. That can be a problem because it can give URLs that aren't necessarily site accurate for Exchange. Okay. Auto-Discover, probably all familiar with Auto-Discover, how do I find my mailbox? That's Auto-Discover v1. Auto-Discover v2, it's the service that Teams uses, for example, to find your mailbox. Auto-Discover v2 is used by the Auto-Detect service. Now, Auto-Detect is a thing that came with Outlook Mobile when Microsoft bought a company who were the programmers who wrote the original Exchange Mobile application. They had a service called Auto-Detect, or I don't know what it was actually called, but they had a service that's now called Auto-Detect. And the job of Auto-Detect was when you typed in an email address, was for the Accompli service, and now the Outlook Mobile service, to work out where your mailbox was. Is your mailbox in Gmail or Outlook.com, or is it Exchange Server, or is it Exchange Online, for example? Where is your mailbox? And then to run the correct service or series of steps to configure that mobile phone to connect to the right endpoint. Okay. So, for example, if your mailbox is in Exchange Server or Exchange Online, the process for finding where your mailbox is Auto-Discover. So on the phone, it needed to do Auto-Detect to find where the service was, and then Auto-Discover, having found that you were in Exchange Server or Exchange Online. Okay. And so when we go to the Outlook Mobile client, we configure the steps, and we'll show you this later on. We configure the steps. It's running Auto-Detect for us. It's detecting where our mailbox is, Exchange Server in this example, and then it's running Auto-Discover v2 to connect to the location where my mailbox is. Okay, which for the mobile phone, oddly enough, is the cloud, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Okay. There's a script for testing and validating all that, and we'll run that script as part of the demo later. So test hmaeas.ps1 script. Okay. As we said earlier, potential issues, you may have some sign-in issues. Well, now you can look in the Azure Active Directory sign-in logs and see if you can use that to help you diagnose the issue. Did the user fail a conditional access policy? Did the user enter their wrong credentials? Fairly regular type of errors that people get when they're signing into services, but the Azure Active Directory sign-in logs will present Exchange Server sign-ins just like they show you Teams and SharePoint and so on online services. Right. And last potential issue you may see, you cannot have any unsupported Exchange servers in your estate. In this case, that's Exchange Server 2010. Exchange Server 2010 does not support, but does not support hybrid modern auth. And so if you have any mailboxes on Exchange Server 2010, you have a problem whereby it will try and proxy authentication to a later version. The later version says, oh, I do hybrid modern auth, authenticates the user, passes it back to Exchange Server 2010, and it goes, I don't know what you're talking about, and fails to log in. Okay? So no Exchange Server 2010s in your estate. All your mailboxes must be moved and your Exchange Server 2010 servers removed from your organization. Okay. And so potential issues, it is just 2 PowerShell commands to turn it on, but you may need to be removing servers, you may need to be updating clients to make this work, for example. Okay. So what does hybrid modern auth not do? Okay. Well, hybrid modern auth doesn't do anything to do with OA, Outlook Web Access, and Exchange Control Panel, the web browser. Okay. They are not using hybrid modern auth. That's a forms-based authentication typically. There's a couple of other options that you can do. You can use Azure AD App Proxy or ADFS to provide token-based authentication for OA and ECP, but turning on hybrid modern authentication will not change the authentication for OA. So for example, let's say you have a firewall update, your firewall team breaks it and there's no connectivity to Azure Active Directory. I speak from experience as a customer did this. While the firewall team is fixing it and allowing access back to Azure Active Directory, you can still log into your mailbox with OA, for example, if you've still got forms-based authentication turned on. Okay? It won't, just because MAPI over HTTP is broken because cloud access to Azure Active Directory is gone, doesn't mean OA is unavailable. Okay. And as we mentioned earlier, upon implementation, you can turn off basic authentication on Exchange Server 2019. Okay, so you can run the new authentication policy commandlet in Exchange Server 2019, and you can block basic authentication. Typically, though, you'll block it later. So you'll turn on hybrid modern auth. You'll be happy it's working. Okay, you'll make sure that there's no older clients or anybody still using basic authentication, and then you'll block basic authentication. Your most likely example there would be an Outlook mobile user who had made an Outlook mobile profile before you turned on hybrid modern auth. They would still be using basic authentication. And you can go and block that. You can block Outlook mobile with basic auth as a device type in Exchange Server. So you can set a mobile device policy in Exchange Server and say, we're not letting Outlook mobile with basic auth connect. Even before you turn basic authentication off, so forcing people to delete the profile and recreate the profile so that it works again, for example. Okay. So we've talked about turning it on. We've talked about the requirements to do that. We'll have a look at a demo in a few moments. But before that, what's the end user experience and what am I going to see? Or almost next to nothing. Okay. If I have a requirement in conditional access, for example, I require you to do MFA, then you haven't done MFA recently, you've got Teams open, for example, and you've signed into Azure Active Directory and you've done an MFA prompt in Teams or in Azure Active Directory when signing into Teams, for example. Let's say we've done that and now I swap Outlook or Exchange Server over to hybrid modern auth. Because I've got a valid token and it's got MFA as part of that token and it's all still within date, Exchange Outlook client will see that. You'll use the shared token on the device and it will sign in and there'll be no prompt to the user. MFA is completed because the token has MFA within it. But let's say you weren't a Teams user, you had no other cloud services out there, and Exchange Server is the first cloud service. That's a weird way of saying it, isn't it? The Exchange Server is the first cloud service that you're turning on using hybrid modern auth. So people haven't registered for MFA, they've not done an MFA prompt before, then you may find
Looks like we may have lost Brian to his router woes. As he told us, he will be coming back to us as quickly as possible. Oh, Brian,
so can you hear now?
there?
Yes, yeah, I'm on my phone. So
okay, yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, right. So I'm on a 4G connection, which is not brilliant, but I can keep going through the slide I'm on, and hopefully in a couple of minutes get my screen back and go straight to the demo. Okay. So I was saying, what's the end user experience? Well, it's not like this, where your internet dies and you can't log in and you can't get your email or you can't complete a Teams call. There's next to no change for the end user. They will go from using basic Kerberos auth or whatever, and they will see
well, everyone, let's give Brian just a few minutes to get his internet sorted, and he'll come back to us as soon as he can. Thank you for your patience.
Let's see, still on my 4G
Oh.
backup. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I think I managed to press the mute button on my phone with my ear, which is not a brilliant thing to do when it's my backup, is it? There we go. Right. It wasn't intentional, and it wasn't a way of trying to save time for 3 minutes. Right. Okay. So I was saying, if from a user experience, so if I have a conditional access policy that says you must do MFA now, it may be that I'll get an MFA prompt in Outlook when I first turn this on, but you can control that. You can do things like, yeah, we're going to turn MFA on in a couple of weeks' time, for example. So we swap people over to hybrid Modern Auth. There's no change of experience to the user, and then we start rolling out MFA a couple of weeks later. For example, they can be ways of coping with and managing the change that the user is going to get. Okay. What other things did I have on that slide? Let's go and see. I'll find that slide and talk about it. You might be able to see it on the screen. You might not be able to. But the second thing I said on my slide for end user experience was Outlook Mobile could start to use app protection policies. Now, app protection policies are from Intune, and they allow you to turn on or turn off. You turn on an app protection policy, and it allows you to do things like limit copy and paste, or no backups of data to other cloud services and stuff like that. And so we can do things like have an app protection policy, which typically would work with my Exchange Online mailbox. Well, I can have my app protection policy work with my Exchange server mailbox as well. And so that means that I can keep people on premises for whatever reason I have for keeping them on premises, but still have some of the functionality that I get with Exchange Online mailboxes with respect to app protection policies. Again, you don't need to turn these on. What it's called is licensing via Intune. If I don't have an Intune license, then I don't get the management and I don't get the app protection policies. But I can still do the hybrid Modern Auth. Okay, I think my internet backup. Let's pop back to more and get let into the meeting.
Okay, can you hear me now?
You sound good, Brian.
Yes,
Excellent.
we can.
Okay, right. Let's hope we keep another half an hour and we don't lose my internet again. Right, okay. So we've done the first two. If you can see the slide, it says can control hybrid Modern Auth rollout by the enable ADAL registry key. So we talked earlier about how if I'm running Outlook Anywhere, hybrid Modern Auth won't work, and I can use Outlook Anywhere as a way to control the rollout. So I turn on hybrid Modern Auth, and then I move people to MAPI over HTTP bit by bit. So as a way of piloting it rather than turning it on big bang for everybody all at once. Another way of doing that is to roll out the enable ADAL registry key. So if I'm Outlook 2013, hopefully not Outlook 2013 clients, I could say you stay on basic auth by ensuring that you don't have the enable ADAL registry key or enable ADAL equals 0. Outlook 2013 needs enable ADAL equals 1, and then it will start doing Modern Auth. And for 2016 and later, and the click to run client from Office 365, if I rolled out enable ADAL equals 0 to those machines, then I could control via group policy the ability to roll some people into hybrid Modern Auth as well, rather than just turning it on big bang. Okay, so although it's a 2 PowerShell commandlet to turn it on, it is an org-wide change. There are a couple of things I can do to pilot it and to test it. You need to plan those in advance, but you can do that. Okay. So let's have a look at a demo. And for this, I'm going to share my screen. And on my screen, I've got an Exchange server. There's my Exchange server. I've got a domain controller that I'm not going to use over on the left-hand side, and I've got 2 clients. Okay, so let's have a look at client 2 to start with. I've got on client 2 a user signed in, and we want 1 email sent to themselves. I'm just going to right-click the Outlook icon down by the clock. And if I do that with the control key held down, you'll all know this one, but if I do that with the control key held down, I can choose the connection status menu item. And that gives me a dialog box showing me how I'm connected. And in this particular case, the thing I want to draw your attention to is the auth end column here, and it says negotiate. Okay, so that's not using hybrid modern auth. Okay, we're going to change to hybrid modern auth. We're going to come back here and we're going to see what this does. Okay. Now, when I sign into Outlook, into Exchange Server using basic authentication or negotiated authentication in this case, it will keep that authentication method going for a while. Okay, so what I'm going to do on this example here is I'm just going to reboot this client so that I haven't restart, not shut down, that'd be a problem. So I'm just going to restart that client. So when I've got hybrid modern auth turned on in a little bit, I'm going to be able to start Outlook in effect for the first time. Otherwise, what happens is you stay connected on basic auth, and within a day or 2, assuming no reboots, you change over to hybrid modern auth in the background. So if you were doing this as a rollout and you wanted to test it over a weekend, so you do your 2 PowerShell commands, you would take a machine that you hadn't logged into for a couple of days, or you'd take a machine and you'd reboot it. And that's a good way of trying to force a new session to the Exchange server and therefore use the new authentication method, and thereby proving, I've turned it on, it works successfully. I can go home and have the rest of the weekend at home, for example. Okay, so I've got a bunch of Notepad documents here, and I'm just going to copy and paste and tell you what I'm doing in each of these. So the first thing I need to do is in Exchange Management Shell, let's clear the screen there, I need to look at the virtual directory URLs for my organization. Okay, so I've gone to, let's say, auto discover. It doesn't have any, so I don't need to worry about that. I've gone to things like the Outlook address book, and I can see that it's mail.contosochemists.co.uk, both for the internal URL and the external URL. And I can see I've got the same URL for the client access service. So that's the auto discover service internal URI. So the service connection point URL for auto discover internally. Okay. And I can see if I scroll up, because I've got a big font on, so it's easy for you all to see. I can see that for my web services virtual directory, I've got, again, mail.contosochemists.co.uk. And for my MAPI virtual directory, I've got the same. So in my example, I've only got a single URL within my whole organization. Okay. I've also got autodiscover.contosochemists.co.uk as well, so don't forget that one. Okay, so that's my first commandlet I need to do, is get the virtual directories that I'm using within my organization, okay, from every server. Okay, so if I've got a multi-server environment rather than this demo environment, a multi-server environment, I might find there's many. So I might have things like, for example, let's copy that. I might have things like mail, auto discover, so make a note of them. But I might also have things like, US mail, UK mail, etc. I might have a bunch of URLs that come out of this. And so I want to make sure I've got this list. Okay. Step number 2, when I've got that, is to update the Azure Active Directory with these URLs. Okay, so I've already done this because it takes a little bit of time, but I'll show you what I was doing. So in my other PowerShell window, I've already connected to Azure Active Directory, the connect MSOL service commandlet, and I've run this. Okay. So if I run it now, it's going to show me the updated results. So I'll just run that, but I'll come back to my Notepad, and this is what I had beforehand. So before I updated the SPNs, I had mail.contosochemists.co.uk, no / at the end. That was put there by the hybrid Exchange server, the hybrid wizard for Exchange server. Okay. I've got all these that all start with a odd GUID, that's a known GUID. Okay, I can ignore those. And I've got a bunch more that start with HTTPS. And we'll see these are all things like Outlook.com, Outlook Office365.com, and so on. Okay, there are basically all the different URLs I could type in to reach Exchange Online. What I need to do is make sure I've got all my Exchange Server URLs in there as well. So let's have a look at what I've currently got. So what I've done is go back to my notepad. I can run this PowerShell, and this is all in the documentation. I can get a variable, for example, X. I can get all the service principal names for that GUID, which is Exchange Online. And then I can add additional service principal names. Okay, so I would have one of these rows for each of my URLs. Okay, so earlier, for example, have I just gone?
No, we can still hear and see you.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Okay. Hey, my phone died. That's what was going on there. Right. Okay. So I was saying yes. So we'd add one row for each URL that I discovered in the previous step. So if that was the URLs in my previous step, then I'd have 4 rows adding each URL. Okay. The documentation, don't know the answer to this. The documentation finishes them with a /. Okay, and the hybrid wizard, in my example, added one without the /. So what I found when I'd run my command here at the bottom, where I added my 2 URLs, so mail.contosochemists.co.uk and autodiscover.contosochemists.co.uk, when I'd done both of those, I ended up with a mail.contosochemists.co.uk / and one without a /. It doesn't break anything. It's possible, of course, that needing the / makes it work, but it doesn't actually matter. So I run the get msol service principal command again, and I've got the 2 that I added plus all the original ones that were in the list before I started. Okay, you obviously don't want to lose this list, because otherwise you'd kick people out of Exchange Online for your tenant, and that wouldn't be good either. So you're adding your service principal names to the existing list. Okay, so that's step 2. Okay, step 3, make sure, and this is by default they do, but make sure that all your virtual directories support OAuth, OAuth being Modern Authentication. So let's go back to Exchange Server. Let's clear the screen again and run that commandlet. And we can see, let's just scroll back up. For example, the MAPI virtual directory supports OAuth. The Web Services virtual directory, OAuth authentication is true. The OAB, the address book virtual directory, OAuth authentication is true. Auto-discover, OAuth authentication is true. So it's a slightly different look. It looks slightly different for the MAPI virtual directory than the others, but we can see that OAuth is turned on all of the virtual directories that I'm interested in. Okay, that's the default experience. And so you probably don't need to change that, but obviously if you found, for example, that one was false, you would need to know, set Web Services virtual directory, server name, OAuth authentication, $true. Okay, and do that per server. Okay, and so we're ready to turn it all on. And here's the 2 PowerShell commands to turn it on. Okay, I need to set the authentication server and set the org config. Okay, so this is the one that turns it on. It says the OAuth 2 client profile enabled setting, and the top one just says make Evo STS, which is the a name for Azure Active Directory. It's the endpoint in Azure Active Directory that does the authentication. Make that the default endpoint. So we set Evo STS as the default endpoint, and then we turn on Modern Auth. Okay. So let's have a quick look and grab both of those, for example. So in my Exchange, I can go get auth server Evo. Okay, and we see we've got let's do forward list for that. Okay, and we can see, for example, enabled false. So it's not the default authorization endpoint. Sorry, authorization endpoint is currently turned off. And set org config. So if I go get org config format list OAuth, okay, and we can see that OAuth client profile is currently turned off. So hybrid modern auth is not turned on in my organization. But let's take those 2 PowerShell commands and run them. Okay, there we go. It's now turned on. If you've got multiple tenants, let's go back to that Evo STS one we had just to show you something. Get auth server Evo name. There we go. The name of the service is evo sts hyphen the GUID of your tenant. Okay? If you're in a multi-tenant environment, so it's one exchange org to many tenants, you'll have an evo sts for every tenant. Okay? You only turn it on in one tenant. Okay. If you turn it on in the second tenant, it will turn it off in the first tenant. So only one can have is default authorization endpoint true if you have more than one. Okay? So if you know which is the tenant that you're going to turn it on to, rather than set auth server evo sts star, it will be evo sts and the GUID would be in the commandlet you would use. Okay? The domain name, that's the onmicrosoft.com domain name. So that will belong to your tenant. So my Contoso Chemists is a Microsoft demo tenant, so it has a strange code here, but it's the onmicrosoft.com domain name for your tenant. Okay. So that's it all turned on. Let's go back and connect to my server and sign in as my user. Okay, so I've rebooted this client since, and so this is the first login after this. Let's start Outlook. And we'll do the same as we did before. So Outlook pops up, disconnected, connected, didn't see any pop-ups, didn't see any prompts, nothing changed as far as the user was concerned. Let's see connection status. Let's see what the connection status is here. And as the demo would have it, it hasn't actually done anything. It still says Nego. And this is the problem we get. Sometimes it remembers your previous login and says, okay, well, I've got a valid login session, even if I reboot, and I'm going to keep using the old login session, and that will work. Okay? So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to change to my other client, client one. Not PowerShell, wrong icon. Who am I signed in here as? Gerhard. It's going quite slowly. Let's do Outlook. Let's start Outlook as Gerhard. And for this user, I've intentionally never connected a profile for this user ever. Okay, so they've never logged in on this client. This was my demo backup. Okay, so I'm going to add Gerhard's profile. It's Exchange. And we'll go through the first run experience. Just to point out, I don't need to go through the first run experience in a real project to get this to work. I'm only doing this here because I'm trying to do it all within 50 minutes and I haven't got very long left to finish the demo. Okay, so Outlook setting up my mailbox. Let's move that prompt out the way. Again, let's bring up my Outlook icon, right click, connection status. And there we go. Okay. We're using Modern Auth because my authentication has changed to bearer. Okay. So that's how I can tell from the client that I've been successful in changing. But you notice there was no pop-ups or anything like that because this client was already using Teams. It's in there loading, but already using Teams because they're signed in with their user account that syncs to Azure Active Directory. And indeed, in this case, because I've got device sync turned on as well, and I've got Azure AD SSO enabled within this demo, there was no sign-in prompts needed whatsoever. Okay? So the only thing I had there in my demo that didn't work was I rebooted the client, I went back in, and it hadn't changed yet, but it will change in this demo in the next day or two. Let's have a quick look and see if it's even changed now. When I tested this the other week, it changed straight away, but it hasn't in this particular case. Okay, so it will kick over, but it will move from Nego or whatever your current setting is, it will move to bearer. Okay, bearer is all about token bearing, and it's a token based authentication. Okay, so that's the demo. That's hybrid modern auth turned on and proven that it works within my client. I've got a quick demo for Outlook Mobile as well. So let me just connect. Start broadcasting my screen. So hopefully I can see that on that display. There we go. Okay, and open Outlook. And if, for example, I look at the screen, that helps. If I skip that, if I add an account here, so let's go get my password up on the side so I can type in the right user. Gerhard M at chemists.co.uk. Okay, now I'm going to go add account. And what should happen here is the auto detect service should kick in, and auto detect should work out that I've got hybrid modern auth turned on and should complete the profile for me. If it gives me a prompt about being Exchange Online or Exchange Server or stuff like that, then I know that auto detect hasn't completed, and I've lost the connection, haven't I? Great.
Right, back on my phone. Working? Can people hear me, or am I about to lose everything right at the end of the call?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Excellent. Okay, so I now am from. I can't see the chat, but and I can't complete my iPhone demo that I was doing in a second because I lost internet right at the end. What I should have seen right at the end was the profile being set up completely. If it gave me a prompt saying Exchange Server or Exchange Online, then I know auto detect hasn't worked. And I mentioned the test HMA EAS script, and I can use that to troubleshoot it. Okay. As my internet won't come back up in a sensible amount of time, Matt, can I or Cora, can I impose upon you to read out some of the questions for me, and we'll do Q&A to finish.
I don't mind taking. So there is one question well, there's a few questions. Gareth Gudger asks, what ways do you recommend to identify basic auth clients on-prem before turning it off?
Brian, I see you muted.
Okay, I'm not muted now.
There you are.
Last time, maybe it wasn't me muting it with my ear. Right. Okay. So Gareth's question: how do I identify basic auth clients on-prem before turning them off? That's actually quite a tricky one to do. Outlook Mobile identifies the device type, so it's something like Outlook for iOS and Android. That string is the basic auth version, and the other one is Outlook Service with no space. So it's one word, Outlook Service. That's the modern auth Outlook Mobile. The other one is, well, if it's Outlook 2010, it's basic, and so you need to get rid of it. If it's Outlook 2013, it'll be basic unless you've done enable ADAL and you've rolled that out. So you really have to have some way of let's say, if you can guarantee rolling out the enable ADAL reg key to all your 2013 clients, then they are able to do modern auth. And if you can guarantee rolling out a setting or making sure that nobody is enable ADAL 0 on 2016 and later, they are going to be modern auth as well. Otherwise, it's then it's really other clients. What other clients don't do it? So Outlook native, iOS native Mail and Gmail both do it, as long as your phone is new enough, you know, 4 or 5 years old, no more. Otherwise, they'll do basic auth as well. But the phones are relatively easy because you can get an Outlook device setting and see, and on a phone you can always move the user to Outlook Mobile so that they are using modern auth, and then you could block basic auth. So I hope that answers your question. It's a bit of a guess, I think, with a bit of extra work to work out.
There is another question from Patrick Robbins. Are there any concerns if Azure AD Auth is SAML federated to, say, Okta or Ping for authentication?
So no, there's no extra concerns. So as long as you do, as long as it works, Exchange Server goes to Azure AD, and Azure AD is federated to something else. It could be ADFS, it could be some SAML-based system. That works fine as well. Obviously, if it's something like Okta, and I've got a client who does this, they've got hybrid modern auth to Azure AD, of course, because it is to Azure AD, but they federate to Okta. I'm going to get an Okta login box rather than an Azure AD login box. And again, I might see that, whereas Azure AD and SSO, I might not see the Azure AD box at all. It just does the SSO in the background. But for Okta, unless I've got and I'm not brilliant on what Okta's feature set is, but let's say Okta is going to always present me with the dialog box, or Duo always present me with the dialog box, and then I'm going to always see the dialog box. Okay. But otherwise, it works. Right. I've got my chat back. So, thank you all for attending. I think my internet's back, but I won't spend 2 minutes trying to join the session again. Before I dropped something into the chat about around those bodies, sorry for and back again. But if you could please fill in the survey for this session, that will be much appreciated. Thank you for all the comments about my internet and the token expired and I lost my internet connectivity and so on. Does Microsoft support publishing OA via Azure AD App Proxy? Yes, they do. Brilliant. Okay, I hope you enjoy the rest of MEC. And if any of you are at Ignite, I might see you there. Take care. Thank you very much. Good day.